I work at the Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands in an institute with a most unfortunate abbreviation, which is why I never use it, the Institute for Science, Innovation and Society. I always say we came first, but that doesn't seem to convince anybody. First of all, I would like to thank Scape very much for having me, for bringing me here, and Robin for asking me to present here, and the STS people. When I was a graduate student in roughly, I think, 1988, I very much wanted to come here to like the birthplace of sociology, of scientific knowledge. And at the time, the only way I could come from Belgium, because I'm from Belgium, the only way I could come from Belgium was if I would change my field and do medical sociology. I could not get a scholarship for doing sociology of knowledge and science and technology studies. So I had to go to the US, and this is my little, because Margaret Thatcher decided that scholars were no longer allowed to do whatever they wanted to do, and I had to do medical sociology. So this is my little revenge on Thatcher, that 25 years later I managed to get to Edinburgh anyway. Right, well, the story I want to tell you is rather more empirical. It's maybe a small story and a big point that I want to try and make. It's very tentative. We're still trying to figure out what it is that we're trying to say. Sometimes it sounds very trivial to me, so apologies. It's all work still very much in progress. This is the overall point that I will try to make, and that is that we're thinking about statistics, we're thinking about numbers, and maybe we need to develop a new ethos of number. We need to find new ways to handle numbers, to talk about numbers, to work with numbers. And the case that I will use to show what I mean, and maybe the general direction that we could look at, is biodiversity data, biodiversity statistics. I will talk mostly about dragonflies. This is a very rare dragonfly, the river clubtail. Not that I know that much about dragonflies, but fortunately I have a PhD student who does, which is this guy, Sander Turnhout. So he's like a co-author of this work. He does he has collected all the empirical information, and he himself is an absolute dragonfly expert. And he is a member of a network of naturalist enthusiasts, people who go into nature on rainy Sunday mornings to go and count birds, or in this case, only when there's nice weather, go and count dragonflies. And he's actually the secretary of the umbrella organization of all these guys in the Netherlands. And he has calculated that of these seriously involved amateurs, so not just anybody, but the guys who really do the counting, work with fonts and all that, there's about 20,000 people out there in the Netherlands, country of 17 million, who do this. And of course, this community is also huge in the UK. This is the kind of stuff that they do. They go into the field, sometimes very muddy situations on the edge of the water, and then they use their big cameras to make pictures of dragonflies. It's no longer considered done to catch dragonflies because you might harm them. So the idea is to make pictures, so you've got huge lenses, and then once you've got a picture, you can try and identify them. And then there's also protocols for these guys to go out and count the number of dragonflies. And once they've counted the number of dragonflies, at the end of the story, you get this, where the dragonflies have disappeared and been turned into blue bars, in this case by the Central Bureau of Statistics, the National Statistics Agency of the Netherlands. The dragonflies in the wild have been turned into a number. An index in this case, you can see 2000 is 100, and then after that you can see whether the population of dragonflies in the Netherlands has increased or decreased. So you get from dragonflies in the wild to a number in the Central Bureau of Statistics Agency database. Now we know, of course, from studying numbers in the past that lots of constructions and transformations go on in this process to calculate something that looks like a simple indicator. A lot of complex stuff goes on in between. And I'll show you some of that work that goes on. We also know that once you have these statistics, they become performative. They have consequences for the lives of dragonflies, in this case, especially through nature conservation policies and management decisions that are made on the basis of these data. So what kind of transformations? I'll talk mostly about the first kind of transformations, a little bit about the second ones. So there are lots of connections here, lots of things that have been written about numbers and about representations becoming more real. For example, in the postmodernist literature, thinking about Baudrillard, about how what you represent becomes more real than the things that you're trying to represent. There's also a lot of work in policy studies. Diane Stone, I think, is very good on numbers. Scott, Seeing Like a State, of course, actor network theory, and the sociology of scientific knowledge. And I'm referring here to Don McKenzie specifically about for the insight that insiders know about the complexity of these numbers, and I'll show you how that is the case for dragonflies. And also, maybe less familiar for some here, uncertainty analysis, Fontowitz and Avets. And I'm giving you this list not because to show off that I've read a book or two, but mainly to tell you that I know that there's lots of stuff already, and I'm trying to add to it, and some of it may not reach beyond what these other people have already said, but I'm trying to stand on the shoulders of giants here. So what happens when you have dragonflies in the field that you try to count is the first thing you need to do is you need to go on expedition. That is, you need to go into the field to try and find them. And these enthusiasts, these amateur biologists, they know how to do that. They walk fixed routes through nature. They know how to identify them in between the reeds, spotting the dragonflies. Once they've spotted it, they know how to identify the species. And then they have registration technologies, forms, notebooks, and then they report those registrations to their data bank, usually through either a paper form or an online registration. And whatever disagreement there is about the exact count or the exact identification is something they will then iron out with the database officer, typically somebody who's employed on a professional basis, paid by the amateurs to manage their data because they think managing the data is too boring, and then they'll iron out the details. So there's some degree of negotiation going on. So this is an example of one of those routes. So you will talk to your data management officer as somebody who's willing to walk one of these routes, and then they'll say like, okay, this is your stretch of river, mark it. The first couple of 100 meters is zone 1, that you'll have to do that twice to make sure that you count them 2 times to check your own count, and then you report them in sections. You do this at least once every 2 weeks throughout the summer. And then there's all kinds of decisions that you have to make. For example, if the weather's too bad, if it's bad dragonfly weather, then you do not count. And there's some indications of how you judge bad dragonfly weather. For example, if the big branches on trees are moving, that means the wind is too hard. But it all requires judgment and interpretation. What is good and bad dragonfly weather? And then once you walk along the water, which in some cases is not evident at all, if you have to walk away through the reeds, that's not going to be simple. The rule is that you count dragonflies 2 meters inland and 3 meters onto the water for the small ones, because that's considered the distance at which you can still recognize them with your camera with the lens. And the big ones you can count up to 2 meters into the water. If they fly here, then you don't count them. So the whole counting process is heavily protocolized. It's just 2 examples of rules that they use for counting. But you can see that every specific rule is a matter of interpretation every time you go out and count. And if you think that this is too inaccessible, for example, then you can negotiate. You have to warn your data management officer that in this case you took a boat because you couldn't get to that particular bit of riverbank. And then the poetry of numbers comes in. Very nicely analyzed by Diane Stone. You've got your taxonomy of species. That's the first thing you need to do. You have to compare the species you find, develop your taxonomy. It's a matter of comparison, what counts as a dragonfly. And then once you find an individual species, you have to see to which one in your taxonomy it compares. So there's a double comparison. The question is not just what counts, but also what counts as. What counts as a valid observation? Right? So you have to, in 2 ways, you have to compare. Do your characteristics apply? Of course, under all the complications, maybe you only got a glimpse, maybe your photograph isn't perfect, maybe somebody else saw something else. All of these things are negotiated. They use field guides to do that. This is the same river clubtail in a field guide from 1997. In this case, with photographs, the field guides also develop over time. Now, normally, These counters do not pull out a field guide in the wild, because if you pull the field guide out of your pocket, that's a sign of being a novice. You're supposed to know this. Experienced people know how to recognize these on sight and know what's in this book and probably contributed to writing this book. So the ones in the know never pull out the field guide, but it's available as a tool for learning how to recognize species. For example, like this is a slightly older guide in black and white, which indicates patterns on the tails by which you can then recognize the individual species. So there's a lot of pattern recognition going on in order to do this recognizing. And in order to do that, these naturalists have what Grassini has called a grid, an observational grid. So I don't have one for dragonflies, but this is a nice one for birds. In order to be able to talk about birds, as you're recognizing them in the field and negotiating this, you have words for naming the different parts of the bird that we as outsiders probably wouldn't even distinguish from each other. These will all be feathers on the wing, but they actually have names for the different sections of the wing so that they can express color. That's that species, because, so for example, there's the crown can be called, but then there is also the lateral crown stripe, which is a stripe on the side of the head, so you can distinguish these from each other. There's a language to talk about how to recognize and how to identify species in the wild, and then they get registered, for example, on forms. This is one for amphibians and reptiles. And what they register can also go through the notebook. These are instructions for how to keep a field notebook. And as you can see, what they register is not just the tally of the different species of butterfly in this case, but also qualifications of the tally, which is it was clouded, the wind, the strength of the wind is noted, the temperature is noted, the name of the person who's observed it is available, the location is available, the time, and so on. So there's not just the one number, I have counted so many butterflies or dragonflies, there's also qualifying information. And that qualifying information goes all together in the database and stays in the database, sometimes with a photograph, and the information is what is it photographed, is it therefore a reliable observation, who observed it. And who observed it is very important because these guys know each other and they can assess to what extent somebody is reliable. So this is a novice. The novice's observations are not quite as reliable as the really veteran in this field who's done this for a long time. There's also checks for errors in the database. So if somebody claims to see a butterfly at a point in the year where these butterflies don't fly, then the alarms go off and then the observation needs to be checked by more experienced people who will go to the same location to see whether or not this is believable. In the case of dragonflies, they go into something called the Dragonfly Net, in the sense of cooperation on the internet. It's presented on the internet. The database is behind it. There's the instructions there for people who might want to join the organization. Managed by professionals. If you would log into the database on the internet and you spoke a little bit of Dutch, you could consult their data and this would produce a map like this. A map of the Netherlands with very big boxes, square kilometer boxes, or even bigger, that indicate where these extremely rare dragonflies have been observed. More detailed data you cannot get, partly because if you get more detailed data, they're worried that then collectors might go to these places to find rare species and do something bad to them. So they have the information, don't quite give all of it. Plus, they say, if you want more information, you must ask us what you need it for. Now, I've given you the example of dragonflies. Within the Netherlands, there are 10 organizations like this who do water species, marine species. They do invertebrates, flowers, fungi and mushrooms, butterflies, mammals, and a number of popular species. And a number of them, like mosquitoes, for example, are not here because there aren't any enthusiasts of mosquitoes who are willing to go out in the field and count them. So what you get is actually what we started to call an organic database, in the sense that it's a living, almost a living thing. You get a whole network of instruments and tools which together, the connecting lines are missing, but together form the knowledge about dragonflies in the wild or about birds in the wild. You get reference collections, manuals, your observational tools, and so on, and your databases. And what happens to this database, the reason why we call it organic, is that the data changes. So, for example, as they redefine the rules for categorizing species or for finding species, they may reinterpret their old data. Or if they discover that one of the novices whose observations they've been registering for a couple of years turns out to be a fraud because he or she just wants to boast about all the rare things that they've seen, then at least those data can be removed after the fact, sometimes years back. Or somebody might say, it needs 2 spots on the wing. Well, in that case, that one I saw 2 years ago was the other species, and then they fix it. So the data change. Sometimes taxonomy changes, so 2 species get put together or split up again, because in reality, species are much more of a continuum than these distinct taxonomies suggest. So the data can change, they're modified, they're qualified, and they're understood. So, for example, one of the things that has changed about observing dragonflies is that originally, identification of dragonflies was based on characteristics that you could only tell on these dragonflies if you caught them and sometimes even killed them. And more recent, as they develop, more recent guidebooks now rely completely on pictures. So the identification rules for recognizing species are based on the assumption that you make a picture and that you are not able to have the species in hand, which those assume. So a changing ethos of observation in the field has changed the rules for identifying species. Right, now I get to my point. These data go in transport. That is, they go from the field where somebody observes them, where all their qualifications in the databases, maybe at most to a map, and then there's a whole set of users of these data outside of these organizations. Secondary users, not just the naturalists themselves, because they also use them typically to make those atlases, but also academic ecologists who will say, give us the data so we can do research. Ecologists who work as consultants, where can a new building project happen or not, what will be the impact of a new building project. Statistics agency then passes them on further. Conservation policy by the government or by nature conservation organizations is very often, to a large extent, based on these data. Based on these data because to send out professional ecologists would be too expensive. If you need to pay 20,000 ecologists in the Netherlands, that's about the equivalent of the number of natural scientists you have in the country at university. So, right, it's quite a lot. In the order of magnitude. We have a few more, but in the order of magnitude. So what happens, builders are very controversial also. So builders might ask these guys to give data about a specific area to see whether or not they are likely to run into trouble because they might harm protected species. And that then leads to interventions, right? Building projects, conservation projects, which might have consequences. Now, from Scott, in Seeing Like a State, we know that if you, he gives the example of a forest, if in this forest, a wild, diverse forest, you only count a few things, and his example is forests in Germany where the king was only interested in firewood and timber. If firewood and timber is the only thing you count about a forest, and not the berries or the leaves or the things that you could use as fodder or whatever, about a century later, your forests look like this, collections of timber and firewood. And so the counting becomes reductive of what is actually in the forest itself. And so these environmentalists, environmental enthusiasts, dragonfly enthusiasts, are also worried about this. They say, if we give our data and we count just a few species, are they going to do interventions in nature which are just going to produce the indicator species and destroy all the other ones? They're very much aware of this. So they're very careful about what data they share. They also say, as soon as you take these data outside of these networks, outside of our database, and you give it to the ecologists, then that's a dead piece of information. There is no backward correction anymore. So your data might be valid now, but a year from now, the data will have changed and you won't know about it. And they also say these secondary users, they strip contextual information that qualifies those data. So we know that this observation is more or less reliable. If you just want that number, then you're going to strip away that context that qualifies the quality of the information. So they're concerned about this. They're concerned about misinterpretation, and they're also concerned about underappreciation of the work of these enthusiasts, because as soon as the data moves, all the work that goes on in between disappears, and then the risk is that these enthusiastic volunteers are turned into data drones. You go and collect data for us so we can do stuff, and that means you undermine their work and also their enthusiasm for what it is that they're doing. So they expect what we've called brutalities to their data. Ways in which the data, the numbers are forced, are changed. A little bit of violence is done to them, but we thought violence is too strong a term. They're just brutalized a little bit. And this seems to increase with distance, because every time the data are passed on to the next user, we've already gone from the field conditions with a lot of complexity to the database, to then the national database and secondary users. And it seems that every time this happens, there's more of these brutalities that go on. So the more hops you make, the larger the risk that the brutalization gets out of hand. So what to do? What could you do to prevent or limit or reduce the brutality that is done to data like this? And that's what we're thinking about at the moment. There are a number of options we think that you could do, and we most certainly won't have all of them, but here are some of the things that you could do. The first is refuse data transport. We've got the data, we're not giving them to you because we know that if we give them to you, you're going to do all kinds of stuff that we can't control, and you're going to abuse it to build buildings in our nature reserves, and so we will not cooperate, refuse. This happens in a number of countries, and there's a couple of examples in the UK where this has happened, where nature organizations have said, look, we really like our mushrooms, and it's not because our mushrooms in my forest are not the most rare ones that therefore you can build in my forest because it's my forest and I care about these mushrooms. So they're not willing to cooperate in this system that balances priorities in nature conservation. Refusal, one option. The other option is to try and conserve as much as you can of the data, of the quality, of the modalities of the data. So you could try and see whether out of the database you don't just take one number, but you take a number and flag it with extra qualities. And this is exactly what Funtovic and Ravets have suggested with their new SAP approach, which is to say, if you have a good quality data, good quality numbers, is not just a numeric value, 98, but also a unit, 98 of what? Obvious. A spread, some uncertainty around it, because you know that you haven't observed the right number, but there's always uncertainties. And then it gets more qualitative. Assessment, is this a pessimistic estimate or an optimistic one? Maybe not all of them are visible. And pedigree, that is, you document the method by which something is tested, how experienced the observer is. You try to maintain some of that context. Now, it strikes me that every time Funtovic, Ravets, or people around them use this method, they always have a different story about pedigree. So this is very much under-theorized. They improvise every time they apply this. But anyway, I think it's an interesting line of thinking. Try to conserve complexity, try to conserve uncertainty. Now, for them, it's all framed in terms of uncertainties. And I think there's much more going on here than just uncertainty, because there are different qualifications that are not only about this representation of the exact number of dragonfly, but it's a direction in which you could think. So a third direction to think about this is limit the number of hops. So maybe we should say, as one of the flags on data, how often has this data hopped? Is it second-hand information? Is it third-hand information? Or have you passed it on 10 times now? Have you recontextualized this number 10 times? So every data could then have a label of how often it's been recontextualized. And in this case, there's a suggestion that by these organizations that they should keep the information and not pass it on to too many other users, but be sort of the guardian of the information and limit the number of hops that occurs. And then along with that strategy, these Dutch organizations have said, okay, we're not just going to hand out the raw data, like the ecologists always want the raw data. Tell us what you want the data for, and then we will produce those data in a report with the story along with it in a way that we think is acceptable. We'll interpret the data for you within what we know about the reliability. So they don't give the data away, they actually sell their data. And then make people pay for it. So as a building company, if you want an assessment of a piece of nature to say whether or not there are rare species there, you have to buy a report from them. And then the income that they have, they use to pay their few professionals, or they'll buy pieces of nature to do more nature conservation. So as a conclusion, I don't have a firm conclusion, just some questions to continue this search. So maybe there are some possibilities or along these lines or other possibilities to prevent these brutalities, a new ethos or new rules or new principles of handling information and the sharing of data, some of which are already being tried out, like statistics agencies now document more about the origin of data than they used to do in the past. So there's stuff going on already, but maybe there are things that we could contribute further. Maybe there are other ways to minimize these brutalities. And maybe then also from this particular case about dragonflies, maybe it would be interesting to think about other data or other numbers, unemployment figures, or, for example, we talked about the ref earlier, but academic output also, you know. So maybe if we count the number of publications we produce, maybe we should say, okay, we've got the count, but we're not going to give you the information because you're going to use it against us anyway. So we've got it, tell us what you need it for, and we'll produce a report. It could be a different ethos of handling data. Anyway, some wild ideas, maybe, hopefully that triggers something. Thank you.